Good evening. My name is Erin Lane, and I serve as the Associate Provost for Campus Equity and Inclusion, and I'm also a faculty member in the law school, and it is with great pleasure that I welcome you this evening to hear some really top-notch thinkers, scholars, practitioners, former public servants talk about the rule of law and its importance. It's also really important that we're gathering here in this room to talk about these important issues, because this room is where we as a community have seen so many government officials, public servants, those who serve us talk about the law and their vision for it. It's a place where we think about things like freedom of speech, the importance of journalism and free press. And so it's really important that we gather here today. I also want to encourage you to think critically as you hear some of the ideas and do what the rule of law requires of us as engaged citizens. So I want to encourage you to listen, consider, carefully evaluate things that we tell our students to do every day here at Drake. I want to thank again all of our committee members, and I hear we're in for a treat because there's approximately 500 questions or so prepared, maybe less, that we're going to consider. So again, thank you and welcome.
Provost Lane, thank you so much. We're delighted to be here. And welcome to all of you to this Rule of Law Town Hall, a nonpartisan discussion of the rule of law, what that term means, what its implications are, and what its consequences are for all of us. My name is Homer Moyer. It's my privilege to moderate this discussion this evening and to welcome everyone on behalf of our two co-sponsors, the Sandra Day O'Connor Institute and the International Bar Association, and to thank our two local co-hosts, Drake University School of Law, which has arranged for us to have this wonderful venue, and the congressionally funded Constitutional Law Center here at the law school as well. We have a distinguished group of guests with us this evening. All have ties to Iowa. They are known to you. Their bios are summarized in your program, but let me briefly introduce each before we begin. To my immediate left is Justice Edward Mansfield, Justice on the Iowa Supreme Court. Next to Justice Mansfield is Carol Hunter, the Executive Editor of the Des Moines Register. Third, former Congressman Jim Leach, who represented the 2nd Congressional District of Iowa for 30 years. And finally, Mark Kendi, the director of the Constitutional Law Center. Thanks to you for being here, and thanks to all of you for joining us. All of us would like, before we begin, to dedicate this evening's town hall to the memory and the legacy of Chief Justice Mark Cady, who died earlier this week. He was a rule of law champion, an icon by all standards, and someone who made quite a mark and leaves quite a legacy. I would also like to say a special welcome to Congressman Neil Smith, who is with us this evening and who the longest-serving congressman from Iowa ever, 36 years, from 1959 to 1995. Congressman Smith, we're delighted and honored to have you with us this evening. Thank you. So with that, we will begin with a brief send-off from our two co-sponsors.
Society at all levels has a need to work together to solve the many challenges facing our state and our nation. I know that it's possible for people to sit down together and engage in cooperative problem solving. And we'd like to create an atmosphere again where there's room for civil debate and consensus building. My hope is to recreate a place that will be a center for problem solving and for bringing together groups with divergent views. This is what I want the O'Connor Institute to stand for. We can do it. The possibilities are endless.
Things like judges that are independent, freedom of the press, and officials who can't be corrupted are just some of the essential elements of what's known as the rule of law. They are the building blocks that support our freedoms. But take one of these elements away, and the rule of law is in danger of collapsing, and our freedoms along with it. So, beware of any attempts to erode the rule of law, because if you look after the rule of law, it will look after you.
In your programs this evening, and momentarily on the screen, is a list of core principles of the rule of law. The term rule of law has been defined in many different ways by many different people. One scholar described its definition as somewhat chameleon-like. But the principles listed on the screen are really core principles of the rule of law, and in almost every definition of that term, you will find these principles incorporated. And so to give our discussion some framework this evening and points of reference, we will have these core principles displayed, and I'd like to begin there and turn, if I may, to Congressman Jim Leach. These core principles are all embedded in our Constitution. They're part of the supreme law of the land. Our founding fathers obviously thought that they were very important safeguards and important to protect us from certain risks. And I'd like to ask you to say just a word about what some of those risks might be. What might we risk if we did not have these safeguards?
Well, Homer, let me first apologize. My ears are not as strong as they once were, but I think it's the first question you put in writing. Is that correct?
Correct.
Fair enough. Well, let me just start about this term of art, the supreme law of the land, is a fitting call for the United States, but that doesn't mean it fits all societies. You can visualize an authoritarian government that says this is the supreme law of the country. It's the fist. And that would make it a very dangerous precept. Now, it's even an awkward precept for this great country. We think of it as a precept that fits because we have a separation of powers model, et cetera. But the fact of the matter is, now and again, even very wise people can make very large mistakes. For example, Woodrow Wilson put in jail labor leaders for objecting to his policy of entering World War I. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, by executive fiat, put hundreds of thousands of Americans in jail. They all happened to be of Japanese descent. Those are extraordinary powers. And in retrospect, historically, we can criticize them. And the only reason I mention this is that we have to be careful. And I have to be very careful with this, Justice, the Supreme Court of the United States can make a mistake or two. And we forget that law is not made just by legislative bodies. It also involves court systems. And courts can, in the end, make law, and it's called, basically, court-made law. And, for example, in the single greatest mistake the Supreme Court ever made was in 1857 in the Dred Scott opinion, when it suggested that a class of people could be bought and sold. That is extraordinary. Now, the second, in my judgment, worst ruling of the United States Supreme Court was less than a decade ago in 2010 when the United States Supreme Court issued the Citizens United ruling that stipulated that corporations could give unrestrained amounts of money into the political process if done in a given kind of way. It based this ruling on the notion that a corporation under the First Amendment can be considered an individual and money can be considered speech. Well, I'm telling you that a professor named Webster, that is Daniel Webster, and his famous book, at least written by his relatives, you cannot find that definition in Webster's, that money is speech and a corporation is an individual. This was a power ruling, it was not a rights moving. The court looked at it as a rights issue. I think they made a fundamental mistake, and we as a society have to think it through. And I hope, frankly, come to grips with changing it, and it may take a new amendment to the Constitution of the United States.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Carol Hunter, it's not universally understood that freedom of the press is protected in our Constitution. In fact, it's the only industry that is mentioned in our Constitution. And we here in this country have never had government-controlled media, but those protections are there for a reason. I'd be interested in your thoughts on the kinds of risks and the reasons for that quite powerful protection for free press.
Well, I think that extraordinary protection certainly is more than ever needed because of the tendency of government to arrogate power and also to act in secrecy. And we see it again and again. I mean, you need to look no farther than the Pentagon Papers case to see the tendency of government to want to exercise prior restraint and hide from the public information about even things as important of the conduct of a war. Just this past week, the Knight Foundation and Gallup put out a survey, and there's such concern about the future of news and news gathering, particularly local news gathering, that they posed the question in this poll whether or not Americans would favor government subsidies of the press. And about 6 in 10 Americans said no. There was some partisan divide on that, as there is so many times these days. More Democrats could tolerate the idea than Republicans. But I was very glad that it was 6 in 10 opposed. I think that any time that you would have subsidy from the government, that the temptation would just be way too great for the funder to think that they could steer news coverage. There already is a great deal of skepticism about the accuracy that's provided by a free press. Let alone, can you imagine, I think, the rightful skepticism if it were a government-controlled press.
Thank you. Justice Mansfield, these principles obviously apply to courts. And in some respects, they set boundaries for what courts can do. As cases come before tribunals, how do you and how do judges think about these principles day to day as cases come before you?
Well, I would say that these are things that we take for granted, really, when we go about and do our work. The sorts of things that we think about in our day-to-day work are, what does the Fourth Amendment say, and what does this law provide for, and those sorts of things. And these are all things that we take for granted, but maybe we shouldn't, and that's one of the themes of tonight. If I could just give one illustration of what the rule of law means to me and what we're maybe taking for granted. And my spouse is in the audience, so she'll remember this story. It concerns a place that's in the news a lot right now. We had a guest in our house who was a judge from Ukraine about 8 years ago. And it was a very educational experience. And I'll never forget the moment that I paid a bill with a check and put it in the envelope and put the envelope out for the post person to pick it up, and she was shocked. You mean you put a check in the mail in the United States? And that to me just kind of symbolized some of the things that we take for granted in this country, and these principles that we take for granted as judges.
Mark Hendy, you're at the Constitutional Law Center. These principles were written nearly 250 years ago. Say a word about their timeliness today. Are they dated? Are they needed as much as they were needed then? Less than they were needed then? How do you think about that?
I think they're incredibly important now, and maybe even in some ways important in unique ways. We've got new technologies that have evolved. So we have mass surveillance, which raises incredibly important issues about privacy, cybersecurity. Certainly in the 1700s, there was much less concern about equality, and now we have very much a focus on concerns about racial equality, gender equality, sexual orientation. Issues of free speech that go even beyond the press are in the news, issues of freedom, religion. And I think the real interesting question, and I'm focusing on the individual liberties part a little bit right now just for time reasons, is we're going to start to see some conflicts emerge between some rights. And there's already some conflict emerging, some people would argue, between gay rights, for example, and freedom of religion. So I think in some ways they're just as important as they were back then, and the issues are becoming even more complex at this point.
One of the central principles of the rule of law is that the powers of the government itself are limited. As we all know, the powers of our government are divided among 3 branches. Each branch is given specific enumerated powers, and each branch operates as a bit of a check and balance against the other 2 branches should they at some point overstep. Justice Mansfield, I'm recalling that Alexander Hamilton, back in the day, stated that the judiciary is the weakest of the 3 branches, yet it falls to courts from time to make decisions of whether other branches have overstepped their powers. When such a case arises and you're faced with maybe holding the government's own feet to the fire, how do you approach those cases?
Well, believe it or not, I think all 7 members of our court are really quite reluctant to find that the government has overstepped its bounds and has acted, say, unconstitutionally. For example, we have one kind of sort of boilerplate thing that we say a lot of times. Statutes are presumed constitutional. To rebut this presumption, one must prove the statute unconstitutional beyond a reasonable doubt. Now, the lawyers in the audience, if you think about that, that's kind of a silly statement, right? It mixes up something about the burden of proof for evidence in a criminal case with a legal principle of constitutional law. It doesn't really make any sense. But what that conveys is how reluctant we are to exercise that power, because we know what a great power it is. When we say a statute is unconstitutional under the Iowa Constitution, that's the end of it. And we're also conscious that we have no enforcement authority. We depend entirely on the good faith of the rest of the governmental apparatus in Iowa to carry out anything that we say and do. Unlike federal courts, for example, we don't even have marshals that work for us. We when the sheriffs cooperate with us in the county courthouses, they don't work for us. When we hold court in our courthouse, in the state courthouse, we ask as a favor that the DPS sends one trooper over during those court sessions, and usually they do. So we have no authority of our own to enforce our own rulings, and we're very conscious that it's a system that depends on all of us to cooperate.
Jim Leach, you have served in government for many years in different capacities, and you've seen checks and balances in operation. How does it feel to be checked or balanced?
Well, I began with a little firmer, perhaps, than I should have, because the Supreme Court of Iowa is one of the finest courts in the history of the United States and of the world. For 18 decades, slavery has not been allowed in this state. For a century before the Supreme Court of the United States ruled similarly, we had rules that related to public accommodations that would be open to all citizens. Same with public education. Many, many decades before the Supreme Court ruled, the Iowa Supreme Court ruled in a very, very majestic way. And so Justice Mansfield really symbolizes a great deal in this group. Now, in terms of separation of powers, though, I'd like to stress something that few people think about. Everybody knows that we have a Congress, a presidency, and the courts, and there are differences, and each tries to hold the other accountable. But what we don't think about is that we quadruplicated the system. You have the same thing in Des Moines. You have a governor, you have a state Supreme Court, you have a legislature. We have the same thing at cities. You have a mayor, a city council, and a city judiciary. And you have almost that in county government, although every state it's wildly different. And the only reason I mention this is that I think everybody in this room knows that something's gone amok in American politics today, and I don't want to get into that for a second, but that is surprisingly at the higher echelons of government. At local level, this state has wonderfully run counties. It has finely run cities, and it has an effective state legislature and gubernatorial relationship that is often of mixed partisan dimension. And you have lobbying that the most respected people in this state often are lobbyists because they're so careful and they don't throw money at politicians the way they do in Washington, D.C. This is a model state for the United States, and it's modeled on the model of our founders. And so for that, I think we should all be very grateful. And we should not be overwhelmed with one part of government not working so well, because we can change that.
We may want to take some of you home with us to Washington. Mark Kendi, let me ask you, speaking of checks and balances, all of us who've been in government have taken an oath to defend the Constitution of the United States. What happens when checks and balances obligations arise, and how do they fit alongside party loyalty? An official in one branch of government sees overreach in another branch, but that branch is controlled by the same political party as that individual. Where should the loyalties lie in a situation like that?
You know, ideally, especially given the oath, the loyalties are supposed to lie with the U.S. Constitution, if you're talking about the federal government, with the state constitution, with state and federal laws. Those are supposed to take priority over any kind of political or partisan interests. And I think one of the unfortunate things that's occurring right now is there's questions about whether the system is working in that particular way. And so this is really, I think, one of the issues perhaps that Congressman Leach is alluding to, is that we want to get back to that system. I think Iowa is what I would call good government state. You know, for the most part, it has a good record in terms of, you know, honesty, transparency, an active press, et cetera. And so the more we can continue those trends and have allegiances to these documents rather than partisan allegiances to a political party, then we honor the rule of law.
Carol Hunter, the press is obviously an interface between the government and the people. Do we need to remind ourselves from time to time that the people are the ultimate check and balance in our system? And is that a responsibility of the press to remind us of that from time to time?
We think so. I think you need only look at something like the local elections we just had. We had a contested mayor's race in Des Moines and school board elections at the same time, and the turnout in the city of Des Moines was 21%. And that's of registered voters, so that doesn't even count the people who didn't even register. So it becomes a very minuscule number of people who are actively participating in our government. The other thing I'd say is that some of the research about the disruption of the news media, there's a term now called news deserts, much like you call food deserts and that sort of thing, where many of the weekly newspapers and even newspapers serving some fairly sizable cities in the country have withered away. And the research has shown that without local news coverage, you have a decrease in election participation, you have a decrease in people running for office, you have a decrease in people saying that they know anything about the local candidates in their government. So I think it is a great obligation of all of us to take part in our government.
A number of scholars have made the point that even with these strong constitutional safeguards and protections, that they are essential and important, but not necessarily sufficient. That we also depend, and the rule of law depends, and democracy depends on some unwritten rules, traditions, sometimes called guardrails of democracy, that are not found in the Constitution. And they cite such things as mutual respect among people who feel differently, civil discourse, public discourse, integrity among public officials, and in some circumstances, self-restraint by public officials. Jim Leach, I'd like to ask you about how polarization, current polarization, has been accompanied by a deterioration in civil discourse, and get your thoughts on how that has affected important institutions in our society, like the Congress.
Well, I don't think there's anyone in this room doesn't see polarization every day today. And one of the great questions is, does Washington lead it or do the public lead it? And isn't it a combination? And basically speaking, as I look back at Neil Smith and the days I spent in Congress, we had much more civil relations. Majority parties tend to be a little more arrogant in any legislative body, but there is a great deal of mutual respect between the parties. Today, you have within Congress what I call the caucusization of politics. That is, every week each party meets to talk about events, and the meetings aren't of a civil nature. It's kind of like a football team at halftime, where you're saying you got to kill the other guy. I mean, it's a really remarkable change. Now, I'm convinced it can be changed because I don't think the public is going to stand it for much longer. And you can have concerns for civility, you can have concerns for how one wants to look at how one votes. For example, I joke within my family that we ought to have a Greyhound movement, and by that I mean Republicans ought to commit to supporting a candidate of the opposing party if that candidate is clearly superior to the candidate of one's own party. And a Democrat ought to commit to voting for the candidate of the Republican Party if that candidate clearly has the superior candidate, and superiority being a definition that includes civil discourse. And that would change a lot. I mean, it would cause people to maybe compete a little bit more on a little bit different status. But finally, let me just underscore, because it's a theme that I talk about a lot, money in politics is not done well by civility. Because the people that give lots of money are not held accountable for saying ugly things, or untrue things, or exaggerated things. And so the fact of the matter is we have to look at certain kinds of reform to come back to a different kind of era. If one thinks of the 1950s and 60s, for example, there were differences, but they were differences that could be resolved. Now they're hard to resolve. And by the way, the harder it is for legislative bodies to work, the more important the court system becomes, because more and more issues will come before courts to deal with.
Apropos your comment, Carol Hunter, let me ask you this. When Franklin Delano Roosevelt was president, and he was elected 4 different times, during the years that he was in office, he appointed 7 or 8 different individuals to the Supreme Court, all Democrats. When he died in office, Vice President Truman, also a Democrat, became president, and his first nomination to the Supreme Court was a Republican, who incidentally was unanimously confirmed by voice vote. I'd like to ask you, if that were to happen today, if there were that type of a bipartisan gesture, what would the impact of that be, potentially, do you think?
Well, I'd like to think it would be a wonderful impact, but it's also one of those hypotheticals that you know will never happen. I listened to an audiobook recently by Justice Neil Gorsuch, and it had the title from the Ben Franklin line, "A Republic If You Can Keep It."
Yes.
And it was a very, I thought it was a very good book that made the case for, his case for originalism in application of the Constitution and textualism in the interpretation of the law, and just in general, you know, saying let's abide by precedent. And he said he wrote that book because of what he went through in the confirmation process, and that he became very convinced that most of the people thought that he should be appointed based upon policy positions, just like any politician. I think it really does rest on the integrity of the members of the judiciary to uphold the independence of our courts. This is something our editorial board has been very concerned about for years, and we make a point of asking each of the presidential candidates who come before us, you know, how they would go about selecting their appointments for the court, and how they would try to decrease the polarization of the process, and not a one has given me what I think is a workable answer.
Interesting. Justice Mansfield, President Martin Van Buren, about whom we don't speak every day, reportedly personified the notion that rivals need not be enemies. And he was a trial lawyer. Every day in court, you deal with parties who have positions adverse to one another. What is your take on this notion that we simply can have opposite positions and disagreements without being enemies of one another?
Chief Justice Cady certainly modeled that on our court. Those of us in the audience, those of you in the audience certainly know that we haven't been unanimous in every decision that we've decided since he became the chief, and yet we remain very good friends and colleagues. When I joined the court, one of the things the chief explained to me, and I think it's a wonderful rule, and I think all Supreme Courts should adopt it, including the United States Supreme Court, is that the majority opinion, when there's a dissent, does not call out the dissent. In other words, the majority opinion stands alone. Present your reasoning. Don't have a separate section critiquing the dissent. If you read many U.S. Supreme Court opinions, they're not written that way. We do that in Iowa. The majority opinion stands alone. And then, of course, there's some rules the dissent should follow, like you don't talk about the other side being judicial activism and things like that, because that's always in the eye of the beholder, or becoming a legislator, because that's in the eye of the beholder. And as well, you criticize the reasoning, but not the motives of the folks that are in the majority. And I think that's worked well in our court, and I would like to see that followed elsewhere.
Let me ask you a follow-up. Chief Justice John Roberts has said that there are not Democratic judges and Republican judges, but once you become a judge, you are an impartial, apolitical judge. And in addition to what you just described about opinions, how do judges implement that and enhance the respect that we all have, generally, for our courts and our judiciary?
Well, again, there's some things that are actually in the rules that we have to follow. We have a code of judicial ethics, and there are some things that are not in the rules that are kind of unwritten rules that we follow. So I'll try and be really brief, but in terms of what's in the code, we're not allowed to engage in political activity, and that's just fine with me. So when someone calls me and asks for a political contribution, I have an easy answer. My spouse has an easy answer. It's very easy. No yard signs, no bumper stickers, no attendance at political events. And this is the only thing that's a little frustrating. We can't participate in the Iowa caucuses. So the most important, probably the most important exercise in democracy that our state engages in terms of its national significance, if you're a judge, you're out. Now, let me talk about what I do personally to kind of test myself and try to make sure that I am maintaining my judicial independence as one individual member of the court. And we decide about 115 cases a term. We have a term system, kind of like the U.S. Supreme Court. So at the end of the term, I want to be able to look back on those 115 decisions and say, there's at least a few of those that the people are surprised that Mansfield voted that way in that case. Because that means I think that I'm doing my job as a judge, that I'm not someone that is predictable. You could say who I am or who appointed me dictates how I'm going to rule. And the other thing is, and this is something actually that Justice Gorsuch, I think, mentioned, I want to make sure that some of those cases I really felt lousy about the decision, because a judge should not be just making decisions that make that judge feel good. If I'm doing those things, then hopefully I'm trying to maintain judicial independence.
Before we turn to freedom of the press for a moment, Jim, I'd like to ask you about one other cardinal principle of the rule of law, which is equal treatment for all people before the law. That's obviously an issue for courts, but it's a much broader issue in our society. And the question I want to ask you is, how are we doing living up to that simple ideal? As history tells us that it's easier said than done. And we may be doing a better job than many countries at working at it. But how do you grade us on equal protection before the law?
Well, we all have to recognize on the really big issues, we've done rather well. We have equal rights for Americans expanded dramatically over the last century. On the other hand, everybody realizes that we probably overdid some of the sentencing. And every study indicates that people of color are disproportionately in our jails. And so we should always work at it. And we also realize that there are different judgment calls on what is a serious crime. And each society, each era, we have to rethink these things. But I want to throw out something that sounds like I'm on a one-track motion. Every judge has to look at every bill, or excuse me, at every case that comes before him on what the law says and how you're consistent with the law. But the fact of the matter is, if laws are unfair, you're going to have a judicial system that will not be equal justice under the law. And so if we move to a system of a corporate democracy instead of a public democracy, you're going to have a totally different set of circumstances on how the judicial system works. And I don't think a judge should be put in the position of having to uphold an unfair law. And in the legislative process, fairness is one of the preeminent kind of standards that has to be applied. In the judicial concept, it's really whether it's consistent with the Constitution and consistent with the law. But judges are going to be put in a very, very hard position if we start making laws that go to the highest bidder. And that is something that is now very much in an embryonic growth way. And we should be very watchful as a society.
Let's turn for a moment to the subject of freedom of the press. And Carol Hunter, you are the editor of a very highly respected newspaper. The press both informs the public of what is going on in government, but from time to time also serves something of a watchdog function, that is to say, reporting fraud or corruption or improper conduct when it occurs in government. In running a newspaper, how do you think about these parallel functions? Objective reporting of the news, investigative reporting of wrongdoing.
I really do think that they go hand in hand. We do have an obligation just to report on the activities of government. And we spend a great deal of our reporting staff is covering like the city council on the local level. We have 2 state house reporters. Across the country, state house reporting ranks have thinned, and that's one place where we still feel like we have an obligation to cover the workings up at the Capitol. And then a lot of the federal government coverage at this point we rely on national wires for. But one of the things that I think has not been a good development in the way our communications work with government bodies is that almost all governments have a pretty big communications staff anymore. And some of what they put out is of use for the public, but say if it's a school district, somehow they don't usually get around to putting out the report about how many violent incidents have been in the school. So that's where an independent press and an investigative reporters are necessary, is to dig out the information that government may not want the public to know. One of the stories in the past couple of years that I'm most proud of, we reported, it's been about a couple of years ago now, about terrible skin injuries that workers at the TPI wind blade manufacturer were suffering in Newton. Now that plant had gotten a lot of notoriety because Newton is the home of Maytag, but those jobs went to Mexico. This was looked at, this new wind blade manufacturing plant, part of the renewable energy growth in Iowa. Lots of presidential candidates came to visit the plant, but the poor and minority workers in that plant were suffering lots of injuries. We dug into the logs of OSHA and found that there had been 300 complaints since the plant opened about skin injuries. We then dug through workmen's compensation reports and found more evidence. And it triggered an Iowa OSHA investigation. It triggered fines against the company, and luckily, thankfully, it triggered the company to change procedures to better protect workers. Now, you use the term corruption. I really think that there isn't a lot of corruption in Iowa government, but there are instances where people are not doing the jobs that they should do to protect the public. And this was one of those cases where OSHA, the public record was there that these complaints had been made, but workers in that department, I don't believe, were doing their job.
Let me follow up with a question about how the media world has changed in a generation. We now have multiple sources of news. We have cable news, we have radio talk shows, we have blogs, we have the internet. Some of these channels have lost or rejected a traditional journalistic distinction between news on the one hand and opinion on the other. Now, is that a deterioration of journalistic standards, or is that new freedom and that allows people both to get more information, or that allows them to get only a certain type of information if that's what they choose to receive?
I'm pretty much a traditionalist on this one. I don't like pointing my finger at my colleagues in the broadcast world because there are plenty of warts in the legacy newspaper world. But the way that opinion and news coverage have blended on the cable channels and even your kind of national, network broadcasters, I don't think does the public a service. Just look at the impeachment hearings. If you toggle back and forth between CNN and Fox, you'd think that they were covering entirely different proceedings. Very little of what the coverage is about news and what was said, or perhaps interviewing impeachment experts or presidential history experts. It goes right to punditry and commentary with a partisan lens. I wish I had a good answer for this one. I'm not sure how we put that genie back in the bottle. But it was Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan who said that, well, I'm going to butcher the quote now, but basically, you're not entitled to your own facts. Yet we have facts that aren't recognized or honored or don't seem to matter in many cases today, which greatly troubles me.
Mark, doesn't this make it a lot harder for those of us who are consumers of news?
Absolutely. Facebook, for example, has basically said that they're going to continue to publish false political advertisements, which is, something that I think is highly troubling. There are efforts and proposals now to do something about not just Facebook, but other social media entities that candidly are much worse than Facebook. Facebook does many beneficial things for people and allows families to interchange information and does have news that's of value, but it's very hard to tell the difference sometimes on Facebook and other platforms. So there are proposals now by state attorney generals to try to examine whether there are antitrust violations. Facebook has 2.7 billion people who use it. That's almost a third of the world's population. So there's the antitrust issue. There are content moderation questions about whether there should be a more active role, which gets to the issue of should it become, in some ways, a little bit more like traditional media, because that's the problem. When it all started with the internet, not so long ago, it was viewed as this very glamorous thing. There's a series of Supreme Court decisions where the court just says wonderful things about the internet, makes it very hard to regulate. We're now in a different period. These social media companies are behemoths. Google, for example, is another part of our world that is very important. But sometimes if you go down the rabbit hole of Google, you end up in a place that's not necessarily where you want to be. YouTube is the same way. I agree with Carol, though, it's very hard to come up with solutions. The main solutions being proposed, as I've mentioned, are antitrust violations, content moderation efforts, and then some statutes that keep them immune under federal law from what they say, as long as they don't interfere with what the third party puts up. And those are all being debated right now, and there's legislation in Congress on this, and we'll have to see how that turns out. But then, of course, that legislation raises free speech issues.
Jim, did you want to add a point?
Well, I just thought I'd give an anecdote about a public official dealing with the press and the word facts. In the year 1800, Thomas Jefferson was competing against the incumbent president, John Adams, and he hired a journalist to call John Adams a hermaphrodite, a term that John Adams did not appreciate. In fact, John Adams thought it turned the election. The journalist named James T. Callender then asked Thomas Jefferson to reward him by becoming the postmaster of Richmond, Virginia. Jefferson chose someone else, which caused James T. Callender to write articles about Thomas Jefferson living a concubine relationship with Sally Hemings. Well, to me, that is a profound evidentiary circumstance on the power of the press. This singular man defeated a living president and defamed a dead president after science came along centuries later to prove that he was right. And so the facts were right in terms of Jefferson. The facts were untenable vis-a-vis John Adams. But that shows that very singular people can make singular decisions that last for centuries.
Mark Kendi, two historians who followed the rise and fall of democracies around the world have written a book entitled How Democracies Die. And a point that they make in that book, and I quote, is that extreme polarization can kill a democracy. And partisan polarization can obviously undermine the rule of law. My question is, how do we know when we get to a point that polarization has become so severe that it is a threat to our democracy?
So that's a great question, of course. There are several factors right now that people look at. There are a whole bunch of books. Some of you in the audience may have even read some of them, obviously. But in general, if you have a dominant political party, that's very important. A dominant political party, if it makes the other political party seem illegitimate, if it speaks about the other political party as if it's not legitimate, if the dominant political party in some way condones violence or other kinds of activities, and if it starts to take action, and this is where it gets very interesting, where it follows the rule of law that exists in the country, and yet that rule of law is being followed in a way to do things that are lawless, such as put term limits as to the age of judges, when if you make the term limits low enough, you get rid of a lot of the judges, and then you can put in your own judges. And there's the Weimar Republic story of how Germany was taken over in part through lawful action. So, these four factors I sort of started off mentioning are a really bad sign. A dominant political party, the possibility of violence, the delegitimation of the, any kind of opposition, and the denigration of civil liberties. Those are the sign that you are going down a very bad path. Last thing I just want to mention and look at is if you don't have a rotation of political parties, on a regular basis, if one party stays in power for a long time and then starts to winnow away at the ability of the other party to compete, then you've got a problem.
Political polarization is unfortunately a natural segue to our last topic, which is the United States Congress. And Carol, I'd like to start with you. Many surveys show that Congress has the lowest level of public trust and confidence of any of our national institutions, the presidency, the courts, the press, the military, law enforcement. Before we turn to Jim, let me ask you, from the outside looking in, what do you see in terms of how this can be changed? The lawmaking body of our government is obviously critically important to the rule of law. And it's, as we've seen, sometimes hobbled, sometimes paralyzed. But what are pathways out of this?
A couple of thoughts. One is that members of Congress themselves, if they would more often return to regular order, so that legislation would go through the subcommittee and the committee process, and then the chamber leaders actually call votes on legislation, so that things like budget bills would be adopted on time and our government wouldn't be up to the precipice of almost shutting down a couple of times a year. I think some basic functions would start to restore confidence in government. I'd like to see other states adopt the Iowa model for redistricting. I think the Iowa model means that a nonpartisan body draws the lines on the map. It can ultimately go, I think, after 3 tries to the Supreme Court, but so far that hasn't happened. But that means that the congressional districts are much more competitive. Across the country, it would mean fewer deep blue, always Democratic seats, fewer deep red, always Republican seats, and it would mean less kind of extreme candidates running against each other, basically just in the primary. And it would mean that the word compromise wouldn't be something that would get boos at campaign rallies. I do think that would help Congress work together. One thing as a citizen, I think you should look at how often a congressperson works across the aisle to co-sponsor bills. We did a story in the caucus cycle just a couple of weeks ago about the 6 senators who are Democratic senators running, and we looked at how often they had worked with our 2 Republican senators, Senator Grassley and Ernst. And Amy Klobuchar had far more bills that she had worked with as a co-sponsor. I think that's very telling.
Justice Mansfield, we've had a couple of references to judicial activism and court-made law and so forth. Republican Senator Ben Sasse has made the argument that what is seen as judicial activism, namely courts deciding political issues, really results primarily from Congress's failure to do its job. That is to say, if the Congress does not tackle and debate and resolve difficult national issues, they tend to fall into the laps of judges through litigation. And courts are then forced to make decisions on political issues. Does that ring true to you? How do you react to that?
I think it's somewhat true in Iowa. I think, as Congressman Leach mentioned, the political process, I think, in Iowa works pretty well. We don't have legislative gridlock in the legislature. We do have a competitive 2-party system in the state. The parties change sides, different parties control different branches of government at different times. But having said that, there are situations where we kind of know on the court that the legislature has kind of, tossed us the ball and wants us to deal with it. And I'll kind of just give a very general example. In the session that concluded in 2019 earlier this year, at the end of the session, the legislature passed kind of an omnibus crime bill, Senate File 589, passed at the very end of the session, unanimously, both houses. You know that's going to be trouble, right? That's going to be something that not every piece of that has been thought through, and they're expecting us to kind of work out a lot of the issues in the courts. And sure enough, we've been doing that. In fact, it started by kind of ruining my summer vacation a little bit. We do have a term system, but we actually had to hear some cases in August relating to Senate File 589. So that would be one example.
Jim Leach, this polarization in Congress, it's not always been that way. And we have seen members of Congress able to work across the aisle with others, you and Congressman Smith and many others at different times in our history have been able to do that. How important is that to our system of government? And from your perspective, how do we get back to that?
Well, you're right that we have had problems before, too. Like the 1850s, probably the greatest because of the Civil War looming. But I teach a course in what I call what's precedented and unprecedented in American politics. And I suggest to my class that the most relevant speech in American history is the first speech a public official has ever given. And that's the first inaugural of George Washington. And Washington, and I really recommend people to read it. It's really hard to read because the language is old-fashioned. But he lays out, and it's hard to interpret, but 3 no's. And he said, as advice to legislators, that one should not favor division. And by that he meant breaking up the country. And then he said, you must put the country before the city and the state. And then he said, you should not vote conflicts of interest, in essence. He didn't use those words, but that's what he meant. And then he said, here is how you make decisions. And it's an old-fashioned set of terms, and I forget exactly what they were, but he's saying you should rely on your independent moral conscience. And his language is so esoteric it seems trivial, but what he's really saying is people ought to think their own independent judgment based on decent values. And that's not exactly what he said, but that's exactly what he meant. And if you think about that, if you say legislative bodies should operate in that fashion rather than this increasing partisan lineup kind of fashion, where if you break with the party, you are basically disloyal. And that is really awkward. I mean, I think people ask me, wouldn't I rather be back in Washington today? And I say, no, my constituents gave me the greatest favor I could possibly have been given. It would be really hard to be in a political party circumstance where you're supposed to go along with the party leadership. And both parties are being led by different types of people, but and I have a great deal of respect for some of them and many of them and a few of them. But to go on, you've got to return to people recognizing that the game that's being played of politics should not be one of political parties. It's about the team is the whole Congress. The team is the whole legislature. The team is the public. It's not what scheming people put together for their vested interest or their vested ideology.
Just a couple more questions before we open up for questions from the audience. Mark Kendi, the Senate has in the past been known as the world's greatest deliberative body, a compliment it does not receive often today. But this business of vilifying one's opponents, personalized attacks, shows not only disrespect, but also a level of arrogance that suggests that my ideas are the right ideas and the only right ideas. And Carol, you made the point of this leading to compromise being viewed as weakness, and listening or putting yourself in the shoes of others is disloyalty. My question, Mark, is can leadership change this within that body? Is that a way to get past this point in history?
My first thought is I wish Chief Justice Cady could be someone who was the model for someone to be the leader of Congress. I know he was a justice, not a legislator, but someone who can see the idea and the arguments of both sides. I'm going to give another example that's a little bit different. So I spent a year in South Africa in 2000, several years after they had adopted a new constitution, and Nelson Mandela was the president. He'd be another good one if you could have someone like that. And Nelson Mandela took over a government which he was very involved in helping to create in a constitution. And he was determined to have as one of his vice presidents the head of the white national party that had oppressed his people. And the Constitutional Court, which was a new court in South Africa, and this is something similar to what Justice Mansfield said, early on in their debut as a new court in a country that really didn't have a human rights tradition, they had a policy where all majority opinions and dissents had to be critiqued privately by the other side in a way to improve them. So that's just a level of compromise, and I guess that the theatrical production Hamilton has a scene that emphasizes compromise. I think you need leaders who are willing to compromise, who realize that they don't know everything, that they have a lot to learn, and you have humility. And that's what brings me back to Justice Cady, is that sense of humility, which I think is missing in our politics and is perhaps perpetuated by social media and other factors.
Carol Hunter, one final question, and it is, who is ultimately to blame for these impasses in Congress? Does the buck ultimately stop with us, the voters? And do we need to be demanding something different from the people we vote to represent us in Congress?
I do think along the lines of, as we've just discussed, when you're listening to candidates as they campaign, do they say anything that is different from the typical party line? One of the things that we try to ask in our editorial boards, and I would suggest you ask it of candidates running for office, is there something that your opponent is championing that you could also support? And if there's not anything, I think that could be telling. But if they would be willing to say, yes, here's something that I could support, perhaps there's a possibility that they would be open to compromise. And then when they do get in office, take a look at their voting record. How often do they vote across the aisle? Again, I think that could help some people edge more toward compromise than being quite so much in each party's corner.
Thank you all. And let's open it up for questions or comments from any of you. We have styled this a town hall, and so we welcome questions and comments. We like questions that are brief. We like questions that are questions. But please feel free to raise questions. We have microphones in both aisles. And welcome any questions from anyone here tonight in the audience. Sir.
I have a lot of questions.
All right.
How do you see history judging us this current time? I don't know the whole.
The question is, how do we see history judging us at this current time? We turn to our guests.
I didn't hear the question.
How will history judge us and this particular time period?
How do I judge it?
How will history judge us?
I have no doubt whatsoever that, historically speaking, this will be considered a remarkable several decades. Remarkable, in one sense, very positively, that America has never had greater leadership in almost every aspect of life, with the exception being politics. Remarkable in that we have never had greater division with less reason. I mean, one can go back to the 1850s and say the division was much greater, but that was with reason. But why is America going to war against itself? And if you ask, for example, because it seems odd to many people why Congress is looking at the issue of Russian intervention into our system based upon use of the new technologies, the fact of the matter is Russia has a vested interest. And the interest wasn't necessarily about a single candidate. The strategy, as the people that have studied the whole issue understand, they're trying to divide America. That is the goal of the Russian government. And why we can't come together and together say, and that's nonsense, we've got to put an end to it. So little things like there's an issue that some people in America are in the political process want to limit to the greatest extent possible the ease of voting. You have a bill in one body of the Congress to submit financial support to states to help strengthen their defense against these interruptions. And one body refuses to bring it up. I mean, this is really a remarkably awkward situation. Both sides should be fighting together. And I personally believe, and why I'm a little bit more optimistic than some people on the next generation, is that we will learn from this one. And some of the lessons we'll be learning from in the political sphere are not necessarily happy ones. But so much is going well in this society that all we need is to put greater emphasis on quality of candidates, quality of togetherness, and a desire to work together. I mean, this can be handled.
Another question, sir. The microphone.
My question relates to the partisan gerrymandering of congressional districts, and of course we'll go at that again in 1 year. So many commentators say that only about 35 districts are actually ones that are actively contested in most elections. The U.S. Supreme Court keeps declining to intervene in that. Is there any chance for reform either at the congressional level or maybe by litigation can get just fine-tune the presentation of the evidence and the problem?
Mark.
So, in the opinion, the most recent one that refused to make this something that could be adjudicated, Justice, I think it was Kagan, set forth in dissent a formula for states to try to use their constitutions and their abilities to dismantle the ability to engage in gerrymandering. So I guess that's one optimistic sign if you believe this is something that should be adjudicated. The argument against having this be something that should be adjudicated, as you know, is that, well, this is the ultimate political question, so how could you possibly decide, one way or the other, so the courts should stay out of the ultimate political question. But they also said that about one person, one vote. And there are now scholars who are proposing quite important statistical formulas. And the law is not separate from statistical formulas. Statistical formulas are used in so many different areas of law. So I confess, a little bit of feeling here that this is something that is going to keep coming up over time, but eventually the door is going to fall down as these gerrymanders become so awkward. And they work for both parties. I mean, I want to be clear on this, sometimes Democrats have gerrymandered, sometimes Republicans. I understand why judges might be cautious about wanting to get involved, but that was also the reason for the one person, one vote issue not being something that was justiciable. And I don't see a significant difference, but certainly people disagree with me. So.
You'll recall that one of the guardrails that was referenced, one of the guardrails of democracy was self-restraint. And gerrymandering presents an interesting case study of not utilizing the power that you legally have to the ultimate extent for partisan objectives. And you can see it in that context or the context of resorting to every procedural device available to prevent a vote on the substance of a bill. Question, sir.
Yes, so my question is on the freedom of press, so more towards your point, Ms. Hunter, about, if I remember correctly, you stated that the press should be completely independent and not supported by the government. But we all know that the American Corporation for Broadcasting supports PBS and NPR, two of the more relatively independent news medias versus, say, Fox News or CBS or CNN, which are wholly subsidiaries to their advertisements. So would it be better to go back to an older system, say, of pre-1980s when there was some regulations put in place to make sure that there was fairness and some subsidies going to government overwatch of the news medias?
Okay, tough one. First of all, I do think that our own Iowa Public Broadcasting System, the national PBS, do some very fine reporting. And I have not ever detected any government interference in their programming. That doesn't mean that I think all media, it would work if all media were subsidized. And I don't certainly sense in the Congress or the Iowa legislature the desire to support a whole lot of other media. There's regularly proposals to cut both the PBS and Iowa Public Broadcasting. I don't know. I think there are certain ways, such as I think you could arbitrarily limit the cost of advertising on the public airwaves, for example, political advertising, as a way to start getting some of the money out of the system. I think because they are the public's airwaves, I think there is some wiggle room there where even the most ardent defender of free press could say, yes, there could be some regulation there. But there's lots of things where I'd want to do a lot of talking and have some reservations too.
Sir.
I would speak in the area of Carol's domain as a citizen, not always having agreed with the Des Moines Register, but however I see the real losers in the question that's going on about readership and circulation and everything else The losers are the citizens themselves, because to me, the newspapers and the press of that kind have been the common element through which citizens could express themselves. If one of your reporters writes something and I don't agree with it, you put their email and their name there, and I can go to them and say, here's why I don't agree with you and something I think you should consider. I just think that so many times we have this tendency of thinking that that's a Des Moines Register problem, or whatever newspaper it might be, not seeing the part that it plays in our lives and our ability to petition government as citizens. So my question to anybody is, what can we do to help everyone see that we really are in this together?
I have some grave concerns, frankly, about how we as a society are going to basically communicate with one another into the future. The model of kind of the local newspaper and the business model of advertising clearly isn't working the way it once did, disrupted by the internet. I don't know how many of you read through some of the material in the New York Times Magazine over the weekend about the future of the internet. You know, here we went with something that had such great promise, and we thought would lead to this age where hierarchies would crumble, and it would you know, give the knowledge of the world in the palm of your hand, you know, and the power of your ideas could rise forth. This very utopian vision of the internet, and instead what we've gotten is, you know, cat memes and a great way to share pornography. There just isn't, it doesn't feel like anymore that shared space for conversation and discourse and a place to come together to converse about how society should function. And I don't have the answer to that one, but that could keep me up at night if I weren't so tired trying to keep the paper going.
Let's take one more question, please.
I appreciate it. Thank you. My question is directed to Justice Mansfield. I was fortunate enough to meet with Professor and Representative Jennifer Confirst and recently, and she talked about being able and people not paying attention to state issues or state legislation. So I'm just wondering, my question simply is, how do we direct attention to state issues and state legislation, just besides those impacted? How can the public be more active and aware of issues locally?
Yeah, we're aware, I will say, but that's because I get paid to be aware, you know. So I think it's hard when you're a citizen and you're busy and you have a regular day job, and then you need to pay attention to the legislature as well. And I guess the irony is when you have a functioning legislative process like we do in Iowa, and it's a pretty compressed session, about a 4-month session, things happen very quickly, and often more quickly than the public becomes truly aware of them. And so I don't know the answer. I share Representative Confirst's concern, and I wonder about that question. What can we do to make the people more attentive?
We turn to our panel and ask if there are any final comments from any of you. Mark?
Just one comment. The discussion we've had about the norms of the citizenry, the values people have, there's a phrase about constitutional law without constitutionalism. In other words, one of the problems is even if we have a beautiful constitution, unless we share the values of that as individuals, it doesn't matter how beautiful it is. It's up to us, we the people. The Soviet Union actually had some very beautiful parts of its constitution, but it didn't have constitutionalism. And the phrase has a lot of derivations in Africa, so it's not meant to be a closing message so much as there is room for us and the citizenry, we the people, to make a difference in this area, and the more we can do, the better.
Let me just stress that there's nothing more important in the public life than the people of the United States. We have an incredibly impressive country of people. If you think about it, it's non-elected people that have made the greatest difference. You take Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote a novel called Uncle Tom's Cabin. It is what galvanized the whole movement to free many Americans from slavery. That's astonishing. She was not elected to anything. We had a lady from Charles City, Iowa, who went to Iowa State College at the time, who became the founding leader of the American suffrage movement. 23 years she was the leader. When we passed a constitutional amendment to allow women to vote, that day she formed the League of Women Voters. That is real leadership. She was not elected to anything. And then you have Martin Luther King. Where was he elected to anything? And yet he led a movement to advance civil rights and also to underscore that the issue wasn't simply rights, it was respect for people. These were American citizens unelected, and there's no reason that they can't rise again. And decent people coming together can do unbelievable amounts of anything. Thank you.
One thing I would ask of everyone in this audience and every reader of our publication or just consumer of information is that I actually invite you to be very skeptical readers. And I would hope that there's more education, more civic education, but also just education about how to be a better informed citizen and someone who is a skeptical consumer of information. The internet is such a cesspool of information in some ways, and also the sublime. And I would ask you to look at what is the original source of this information, what is the credibility of that source, what is the documentary evidence. Check the math, check the science. Don't just spout what you read on the internet. And I think our society will be better for it, and our press will be stronger for it if readers hold our feet to the fire to uphold some of the basic standards that I think you should expect, which is separation of news and opinion and accuracy of the information we provide.
Well, we've dedicated this evening to Chief Justice Cady. He was a big believer in our state constitution, and a number of the landmark decisions that have come in the last decade under his leadership were based on the Iowa Constitution. And I would encourage those of you who are not familiar with it at all to take a look at it. You can find it very easily on that evil internet that we've been talking about. You just search Iowa Constitution and it pops right up. But it's a very interesting document. It's the same Constitution that was adopted in 1857 by an imperfect group of people, but they had one good characteristic, which was they were irremediably opposed to slavery, and that shows through in that Constitution. And it's an interesting Bill of Rights that's somewhat different from the Bill of Rights in the U.S. Constitution. So I would encourage all of you to take a look at it.
Please join me in thanking this wonderful panel for this evening.